before we dive in, hit subscribe if you dare. Stories like this don't just keep you up at night. They change the way you see justice forever. The Silent Kings of the Cell Block. One of the most widely known cases unfolded in the United States with Benjamin Tango Ben Trujillo, a high-ranking member of the Tango Blast Network in Texas. Even while incarcerated, Trujillo managed to coordinate street-level drug movement and structure internal alliances that spanned multiple state units. Investigators later revealed that his communication wasn't loud or obvious. It was subtle, hidden behind coded messages passed during mealtimes and short interactions in the recreation yard. What made Trujillo's case stand out was the precision. He didn't rely on chaos. He relied on organization. Intel reports showed that he used the prison's own routines, laundry rotations, medical call-ins, and commissary schedules, as meeting points for his network. It was a quiet empire built not through force, but through coordination and loyalty. When authorities finally intercepted key messages, they realized he had managed to influence both incarcerated members and individuals outside the prison for years. Another real case came from Los Angeles County's jail system, where the Mexican Mafia, also known as La IM, maintained a powerful internal hierarchy. A documented leader, Rodolfo Cheyenne Cadena, had shaped the foundation of the organization's influence decades earlier, but the legacy continued through generations of inmates who followed the strict code he helped build. What made the Mexican Mafia's prison influence so unique was its structure, almost military in nature. Members who were locked in segregation units could still send directives through trusted intermediaries, creating a chain of command that continued even under the highest levels of security. Officers reported that a single message, sometimes just a few words written on a scrap of paper, could shift behavior across entire blocks. While the gang's activities were monitored and targeted by law enforcement, the internal loyalty within the prison made it fiercely resilient. The system they built was a reminder that a prison sentence did not truly sever influence for individuals already tied to complex underground networks. Across the ocean, Brazil witnessed its own powerful prison-based gang evolution with the rise of the Primeiro Comando de Capital, PCC. One of the most central figures, Marcola, became well known for organizing and expanding the group even while serving his sentence. His influence extended far beyond the walls of Brazil's high-security facilities. The PCC operated with discipline, enforcing strict internal rules among members and creating what some investigators described as a parallel governance. What stood out most about Marcola's leadership was how he used knowledge, not fear, to strengthen the organization's structure. Reports indicated he studied law, political systems, and organizational strategy during his incarceration. This allowed him to reshape the PCC from a local prison group into one of the most structured criminal networks in South America. His story highlighted a reality shared by many countries. When an inmate understands the weaknesses of a system, they can sometimes exploit it more effectively from inside than outside. These three cases, from the U.S., Mexico's prison networks, and Brazil's PCC, reveal a consistent truth about modern corrections. Power does not always disappear behind bars. In many situations, it becomes more concentrated. Some inmates discover ways to use confinement as a strategic advantage, relying on communication, loyalty, and structure rather than physical presence. Their stories shaped national policies, inspired new security measures, and forced prison systems worldwide to rethink how influence operates inside controlled environments. How power moves behind bars. In the United States, investigators learned this lesson the hard way during federal operations targeting the Aryan Brotherhood, one of the most researched and documented prison gangs in the country. Despite being housed in some of the most restrictive environments, high-ranking members found ways to communicate by using what officers called ghost routes. These were indirect chains of communication, often involving inmates in different housing units who would pass messages during work detail, kitchen duty, or hallway movement. The messages themselves were rarely obvious. Some were written in extremely small lettering on bits of paper known as kites, folded into almost invisible strips. Others were memorized and passed verbally, but only through trusted intermediaries. Federal reports later revealed that a single message could travel across an entire facility without any two inmates appearing to interact directly. This level of organization demonstrated how influence could flow even when surveillance seemed airtight. In California, The Mexican Mafia demonstrated a different kind of internal control, one rooted in structure and discipline. Members who had been in the system for decades trained newer inmates using codes of conduct that resembled military orders. These guidelines defined how to behave, how to communicate, and even how to resolve disputes without drawing unnecessary attention from officers. What made the Mexican Mafia's network effective was that much of its power came from the perception of authority. A directive didn't need to be enforced violently to be obeyed. It only needed to be believed to have come from a legitimate internal source. Former security officers later revealed that some of the biggest shifts in behavior on a yard, sudden peace, sudden tension, or sudden silence, were caused by the arrival of a note from a leader housed hundreds of feet away in segregation. Control wasn't always about force. It was about reputation, communication, and a unified internal culture. Meanwhile, in Brazil, the PCC's internal power evolved using principles more commonly seen in formal organizations. Under Marcola's influence, the PCC established rules that emphasize internal discipline, loyalty, and financial responsibility. Members followed a structured hierarchy, and decisions were made collectively through established channels. Investigators noted that PCC communications often use business-like language rather than coded slang. Their messages discuss budgets, scheduling, and operational planning. Brazil's prison conditions, overcrowded, understaffed, and stretched thin, created an environment where an organized group could operate more efficiently than the system itself. In some facilities, PCC members handled conflict resolution and internal order faster than officers could. This did not mean they were legitimate authorities, but it demonstrated how a structured network could fill gaps inside a strained system. The most consistent factor across all regions was communication. Every powerful inmate leader found ways around restrictions. Some methods were simple: hand signals during recreation, notes passed during library hours, or whispered conversations during transport. Others were far more complex, involving coded financial transactions, messages disguised as legal mail, or instructions sent to outside contacts using prepaid phone lines. Technology, in some cases, made things even more complicated. Smuggled phones became a major issue in multiple countries, giving certain inmates access not just to communication, but to organization tools, financial transfers, and encrypted messaging apps. While many prisons increased their search operations and signal blocking technology, enforcement varied from facility to facility, allowing gaps that networks exploited. What tied all these stories together was a single truth: prison walls can restrict movement, but they cannot fully restrict influence. Every system has weaknesses: overburdened staff, predictable routines, human relationships, and moments of unsupervised movement. Gang leaders studied these weaknesses with patience. They learned the daily rhythms of the institution, understood which officers were strict, which were overwhelmed, and which were easy to predict. Over time, they built influence not through visible power, but through consistent, quiet strategy. The hidden networks exposed. The moment that changed everything began quietly. A correctional officer at a high-security federal prison in California was completing his normal morning rounds when he noticed something unusual. An inmate in segregation had a stack of legal papers that seemed far too thick for a single case. Legal mail is protected, so officers can't read it without approval, but they can examine it for hidden items. When the officer lifted the stack, it felt heavier than normal. Inside the folds of the documents, he found thin sheets of paper with writing so tiny it was barely visible. Each page contained coded instructions, names, and financial notes. It was the first clear sign that someone inside the segregation unit had been directing activities far beyond his cell. Once investigators began looking deeper, they discovered that the papers were part of a larger network of communication. Messages were being moved through different units by inmates who never appeared to be connected. Some of the notes were disguised inside book bindings. Others were hidden in food trays, passed during medical appointments, or smuggled through laundry bags. The discovery shocked officers because it revealed a system that had been operating quietly for months, possibly years. What looked like a simple, routine facility turned out to be home to an organized communication network that reached other prisons and even touched the outside world. Federal investigators formed a special team to understand how these messages were created, delivered, and acted upon. They traced handwriting patterns. They followed the timing of inmate movements. They studied commissary purchases, phone logs, and visitor records. What they uncovered was a complex chain of influence, where a single instruction from a high-ranking inmate could travel through 6 or 7 people before reaching its final destination. None of those people needed to know the full message. Each only memorized or carried a tiny piece. That way, if anyone was questioned, they could reveal very little. The system became even clearer when officers intercepted a set of phone calls from an inmate in another facility hundreds of miles away. The calls were legal, but the people he was speaking to used phrasing that didn't match normal conversation. Investigators recognized the patterns and connected them to the codes found in the legal documents. Now, they understood that multiple prisons were linked by a shared communication strategy. It wasn't loud, violent, or chaotic. It was patient, careful, and built over time. The next step was mapping who the messages were coming from. After months of monitoring, investigators identified inmates in different states who had influence over their groups. Some were older men who had been in the system for decades. Others were younger but had earned respect because of their loyalty and organizational skills. What stood out was not their physical power, but their ability to communicate quietly and consistently. They rarely drew attention. They avoided fights. They behaved well in front of officers. But behind the scenes, they maintained order, gave instructions, and made decisions that affected entire housing units. When federal authorities finally conducted coordinated searches in several facilities, they found hidden notebooks, coded letters, and even schedules showing how messages moved between units. One discovery surprised everyone. A diagram drawn on a single sheet of paper showing how information flowed from one prison to another. Each arrow represented a communication route. Each symbol represented a trusted messenger. The diagram looked more like a business plan than something created inside a prison. The evidence was enough to begin a large-scale investigation. Courts issued warrants. Outside contacts were interviewed. Financial trails were examined. Over time, the quiet networks that had stayed hidden for years became visible. The system was not perfect, but it was effective enough that outside agencies began using the findings to change policies across the country. Some prisons improved their mail screening procedures. Others changed how inmates were moved between units. New technology was introduced to detect coded messages and prevent certain types of communication. Even with all these changes, one final event caught everyone off guard. During a surprise inspection at a different high-security facility, officers found a small device hidden inside a ceiling vent. It was a basic phone, not a smartphone, but enough to send and receive short messages. What made it shocking was that the vent was above a cell belonging to an inmate who had been under strict monitoring for months. He had no visitation, no group activities, and very limited movement. Yet someone still managed to get the device to him. The discovery raised a new question. If a leader under heavy restriction could still send messages, how many others could do the same without anyone noticing? And just as officers removed the phone from the vent, one of them noticed a small folded note taped to the back of the device. It contained just 4 words, short, simple, and written in tiny print. The message changed everything.